Hey, Cypher here. It's finally time to review the Oppenheimer movie, and it really holds up well. When I made a biography of the man and the A-bomb's creation before the film's release, I got comments like these praising the movie for its accuracy, and I've gotta agree. Not only was it amazingly well put together, but it actually was an interesting twist that lends a new interpretation of this important figure and his legacy. But just to refresh, let's go over Oppie's bio before we get into how director Christopher Nolan made a truly fascinating film that contributes something to historical interpretation. According to his birth certificate, the J in J. Robert Oppenheimer stands for his father's name, Julius, but that is a faux pas in Jewish tradition, so he always went by Robert. A naturally inquisitive kid, he collected rocks, read widely, learned several languages, and went sailing. He went to the Ethical Culture Preparatory School, quickly skipping grades, which landed him in Harvard. He graduated in only 3 years with a bachelor's degree in chemistry, just in time to avoid Harvard becoming the first of many American universities to impose anti-Semitic quotas. He began graduate school in Cambridge, but throughout 1925 through 26, he had a serious bout of depression, even strangely trying to poison an apple for one professor, Patrick Blackett. So he started some unproductive psychotherapy and sought new schools to study at. After a trip around Corsica and some revelatory reading, he seemed to come out of his depression. Finally getting his life in order, he moved to the University of Göttingen, which was the preeminent school in the emerging theory of quantum physics. Oppenheimer gained a reputation for being great at comprehending big ideas and contemplating them while saying nim nim nim, but also for being clumsy with the math to back it up. He made many friends with preeminent scientists and quickly earned a PhD for his work there. After a brief time at a few European universities, where he earned the nickname Oppie, he took a professorship at Caltech. That was only a brief stint, for he got a job at Berkeley instead, building up the department as one of the most preeminent in theoretical physics in the nation, with many close students and colleagues, some called the Nim Nim Boys, because they constantly copied Oppie's mannerisms. He gave the idea or co-wrote many groundbreaking theories, such as predicting the existence of antimatter and black holes. While in California, he observed from afar the rise of Nazism and eventually the Spanish Civil War that Franco's fascists began. In support of the opposition, Oppie became what communists called a fellow traveler. He was active in unionization, helping Jewish refugees such as Albert Einstein immigrate to the United States, raising funds for Spanish Republicans, and had many friends who were Communist Party members, including a girlfriend that he'd have a continuing affair with even after he got married to Kitty Puning. His brother Frank was a more practically minded scientist, a more charismatic character, and a Communist Party member at the time. These sympathies would be used against Robert later, but they were pretty common among New Dealer intellectuals at the time. He was a fellow traveler, not a communist. When World War II commenced, he was fairly aloof, only somewhat distancing himself from communism after the horrors of the Holodomor and Great Purge became more apparent in the early 1940s. In the meantime, the theoretical physics community moved on without him. Recognizing the danger of Nazi science, physicist Leo Szilard wrote a letter and Albert Einstein signed it, warning President Roosevelt that an immensely powerful bomb was feasible based on a 1938 German experiment that split the atom. FDR created a uranium committee to investigate such a weapon, but very little got done that first year. British science moved first. They came up with possible ways to make an atomic bomb, but kept their findings secret. Perhaps the most important of their secret discoveries was the ability to use carbon as a mediator between isotopes, rather than heavy water. Without that knowledge, Germany's project never achieved a chain reaction, which is necessary for creating plutonium and enriching uranium. Therefore, they probably couldn't create a bomb, but the Allies didn't know that and kept forging ahead. By mid-1942, the US war machine was taking the Nazi threat of nuclear war seriously. Japan had attacked in December, obliterating any notion of isolation and forcing American entry into the war. The federal government tasked General Leslie Groves with creating a nuclear program. He was already in charge of creating the Pentagon, so what's wrong with adding another major domestic construction project? He codenamed it the Manhattan Engineering District, but most people nowadays simplify that to the Manhattan Project. As one administrator said, the Manhattan District bore no relation to the industrial and social life of our country. It was a separate state, with its own airplanes and its own factories and its thousands of secrets. It had a peculiar sovereignty, one that could bring about the end, peacefully or violently, of all other sovereignties. Reading the theory on how to build a bomb, he secured a site at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and another one in Hanford, Washington, to create the massive industrial projects necessary for uranium enrichment and plutonium creation. As one author quips, a rock chipped out of the ground by farmers living in near Stone Age conditions was fed into the most advanced industrial complex ever constructed. Next, Groves had to put together a scientific team. He toured science departments around the country. In the process, he okayed the creation of the first reactor ever at the University of Chicago, which achieved criticality in December of '42, the first human-made chain reaction ever. When Groves met Oppenheimer, he was impressed with Oppie's understanding of the task at hand and his ability to talk about history and poetry, so Groves made Oppie the leader of centralizing all the research into this bomb. Robert needed to select a site for this, and he instantly knew where. For years, he had been going to New Mexico to roam the San de Cristo Mountains, buying a ranch he called Perro Caliente because he liked to exclaim, "Hot dog!" In a letter many years prior, he wrote, "My two great loves are physics and New Mexico. It's a pity they can't be combined." Well, where there's a will, there's a way. Undercover, they met in the Jemez Mountains and worked their way northeast to a ranch school called Los Alamos, which is where they placed the new lab that would build the bomb. Oppie had no experience in practical science, nor organizing a large team. His frail and preening disposition didn't seem to entail an ability to lead. Yet, by all accounts, he seemed to metamorphose into the role, organizing private summits and becoming a great leader. So he started to collect the best and brightest from around the country and even a delegation from Britain. Unbeknownst to him, a few would willfully send secrets from the Manhattan Project to the Soviets, inevitably helping them create their own bomb, but the American program was focused on beating Germany. He was approached by a friend about sending secrets to the local Russian embassy in 1943, but refused and reported the matter. At the time, Russia didn't fully understand that the object of Oppie's project was, as one lecturer succinctly put it, to produce a potential military weapon in the form of a bomb in which energy is released by a fast neutron chain reaction in one or more of the materials known to show nuclear fission. Several scientific problems had to be overcome to build a nuclear bomb. They could only refine so much plutonium and uranium. Finding how much of the isotope and how much shielding it took to go critical was such a dangerous experiment that 2 people would end up losing their lives in accidents, both after the bomb's completion. They decided on a gun assembly for the uranium, where they'd use conventional explosives to launch one chunk of uranium into another with sufficient speed to cause a runaway chain reaction. For the plutonium, they went with an implosion assembly, where explosives would cave pieces into one another. The tech for making this small enough and detonating the device on time took extreme advances, all in secret. On top of that, there were ethical issues the scientists had to deal with. Given the power of the bomb they were creating, they understood that international diplomacy would change forever in the blink of an eye. Many discussions were held over the implications of making such weapons. Niels Bohr had this idea of the weapon being so shocking that it would force the world to come together and prevent another war like the one they were currently fighting. And this became the operant ideology of those on the project thanks to its leadership. As one student said, Bohr was God and Oppie was his prophet. But matters were changing rapidly that would challenge their post-war vision. Germany was clearly losing the war. The bombs weren't intended for Japan, but now it looked like they were the only enemy left. On top of that, President Roosevelt died, leaving Harry S. Truman to take over. Before that, he hadn't been adequately briefed on the Manhattan Project, so at the behest of the Los Alamos scientists, he convened an interim committee to decide what to do with these weapons. That committee decided against a demonstrative bombing in Tokyo Bay that would not intentionally kill anyone. The Battle of Okinawa was ongoing and showed that Japanese forces were often willing to fight to the last man. By late June, Japan was on its own, and the US was dropping enough incendiary munitions to cause far more civilian casualties than both atomic bombs would. Furthermore, the invasion of Japan could not happen until November, so the interim committee decided on one test bomb to be done in secret just in case it didn't work, and using the two completed ones on Japanese cities that had not been destroyed by incendiary devices. They also recommended warning the Soviets before sending the bombs. When Truman met with Stalin, he only said that, "I casually mentioned to Stalin that we had a new weapon of unusual destructive force." The Russian premier showed no special interest. They agreed at Potsdam that Japan had to unconditionally surrender, despite the fact that they were very near surrendering if only they could guarantee that the emperor could remain at least as a figurehead.
Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
The interim committee had a reason to rush their decision. With the Soviets about to invade Manchuria, they thought that they needed to use these bombs as not only a way to end the war, but implement Bohr's vision of the last bombing. Back at Los Alamos, Oppie had to rally the scientists who saw no reason to bomb an already defeated enemy. Szilard even wrote a petition, signed by many scientists there, that called for, first, that you, President Truman, exercise your power as Commander-in-Chief to rule that the United States shall not resort to the use of atomic bombs in this war, unless the terms which will be imposed upon Japan have been made public in detail, and Japan, knowing these terms, has refused to surrender. And second, that in such an event, the question whether or not to use atomic bombs be decided by you in light of the considerations presented in this petition, as well as all the other moral responsibilities which are involved. Oppie found this to be a betrayal and vigorously argued against it. He thought that a sudden and overwhelming use of the weapon would guarantee it wouldn't be used again, much like mustard gas after World War I, but this time with the scientific community joined as one behind its abolition. However naive that may seem, he convinced much of Los Alamos, and they forged ahead. Having a PhD doesn't mean that you're smart in all things, says the historian with a PhD. The first test of a non-nuclear detonation didn't go well, but it was because of a wiring issue. The night before testing the real deal, Oppie read some lines from the Bhagavad Gita. In battle, in forest, at the precipice in the mountains, on the dark great sea, in the midst of javelins and arrows, in sleep and confusion, in the depths of shame, the good deeds a man has done before defend him. So the Trinity gadget blew up on July 16th, 1945. It detonated in a patch of desert known as the Jornada del Muerto in New Mexico. The first nuclear explosion ever, and the equivalent of 25,000 tons of TNT. Richard Feynman even took bets on whether they'd ignite the atmosphere, causing a chain fusion reaction via fission 1, a prophecy of even more powerful bombs to come. In a later interview, Oppie claimed to have remembered another line from the Bhagavad Gita.
We knew the world would not be the same. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
They didn't need to test the gun assembly, which they had nicknamed Little Boy, after its diminutive shape compared to the implosion assembly's Fat Man. It's possible these names were jabs at Oppie and Groves because of their statures. 3 weeks after Trinity, a B-29 named Enola Gay dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima. The atomic explosion killed between 80 and 150,000 people, most of whom were civilians, and even a few Allied POWs died. 3 days later, another B-29, named Boxcar, dropped Fat Man over Nagasaki. This one killed between 60 and 80,000 people, almost all of whom were civilians. That same day, the Soviets began their invasion of Manchuria. Not one to intervene, Emperor Hirohito broadcast to his people, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, while the general trends of the world have all turned against her interest. Moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, it would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization." As such, the war was over, but the decision of what to do with this technology wasn't done. Oppie resigned his position at Los Alamos, though UC Berkeley would continue to control the lab until 2006, and they were a managing partner until 2018. He went to Caltech to teach for a brief stint, but was kinda terrible at it. Instead, he took a position as director of the Advanced Studies Institute at Princeton, quickly turning it into another theoretical physics haven, much like he had done at Berkeley. It helps that Einstein was already there. He'd often bring political outcasts like himself to the institute as a kind of academic second chance. While Oppenheimer was transforming the department, he remained extremely politically active, seemingly loving the limelight, but his tendency toward histrionics would quickly damage his ability to make real change. The newly created United Nations was searching for what to do about nuclear technology, and Oppie played a role. He helped draft a report with Dean Acheson and David Lilienthal about how the world could regulate the tech. They proposed to create an organization that was beyond the sovereignty of any nation, with the power to control all uranium mines, reactors, and weaponry worldwide. It was a radical idea, but the United Nations had the possibility of actually creating such an entity and would likely prevent a nuclear arms race. While begging Truman to adopt this plan, Oppenheimer received serious pushback, so Robert claimed something to the effect that he had blood on his own hands, and this was a way to atone, which did not go well. Truman muttered, "Blood on his hands? Damn it, he hasn't half as much blood on his hands as I have. You just don't go around belly aching about it." He proclaimed, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in this office ever again." Truman always called Oppenheimer a crybaby scientist after that, which guaranteed the Acheson-Lilienthal plan wouldn't get adopted. Instead, Bernard Baruch proposed to the UN a plan that would not require the United States to give up the new bombs, of which they had roughly 50 stockpiled by mid-1946. That practically sabotaged any possibility of the Soviets accepting joint regulation and ensured an arms race. Since nuclear armament would remain national rather than international, Congress created the Atomic Energy Commission in 1947, and Oppenheimer was on it. The Soviets had created their first chain reaction in December of '46, and were able to create a replica of Fat Man thanks to all of their espionage during the Manhattan Project, detonating it in August 1949. In response, the Truman administration sought to make a super bomb first proposed by Enrico Fermi in 1941. This would use fission to set off a fusion reaction with hydrogen. The super would be called alternatively a hydrogen bomb or a thermonuclear device, and would cause immensely more destruction than a regular A-bomb. It was a leap from kilotons to megatons worth of TNT. Oppenheimer opposed this, pushing for tactical nuclear weaponry rather than a bomb that could legitimately be considered a genocide in one package. He argued that this would only cause the nuclear arms race to spiral out of control and provide the world a way to annihilate itself. Truman would hear none of it, and forged ahead with the super anyways, completing the first detonation in 1951. The dance of brinksmanship continued with the most cataclysmic weapons ever made. As one historian wrote, The warheads might just as well have been made of cardboard. It was their abstract threat that counted. As it was in H.G. Wells's time, uranium's physical powers were far secondary to the power of the narrative that man could craft around them. The United States and the USSR would be locked together in this crude but effective story for almost 40 years. J. Robert Oppenheimer would memorably call the standoff two scorpions in a bottle, each capable of killing the other, but only at the risk of his own life. Oppie made friends with Truman's wise men, including one that was going through a similar ousting over militarization. George F. Kennan left the State Department in 1950. Oppenheimer gave him a spot at the Institute, despite not having completed any of his historical works, which I have spoken about in this episode. They bonded over this, and Kennan would help him with the trouble derived from trying to stop the super just around the corner. One of the enemies he created due to his opposition was Lewis Strauss, and yes, it's pronounced Strauss. He'd given Oppie the appointment to the Institute, and now made every effort he could to remove the director. That animosity continued for his entire life. Oppie remained on the Atomic Energy Commission. Despite only serving a couple of days a year, he had to keep a security clearance. Because of his previous communist connections, the FBI had regularly surveilled him and wiretapped his phones. They had a 7,000-page dossier on him, and Strauss got a hold of it. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover received a letter from a lawyer who had served on the commission, claiming Oppenheimer was likely a Soviet agent. After so much hysteria surrounding Soviet espionage in the Manhattan Project, it was easy to raise petty complaints about disloyalty, and Strauss pounced on the opportunity. He kicked off a security hearing into Oppie, accusing him of a ridiculous number of unsubstantiated rumors and suspending his clearance.
We have affidavits that he had been a member of the party, that he had recommended communists for work in the A-bomb, H-bomb plants.
This was happening at the exact same time as Senator McCarthy was probing into the U.S. Army.
Have you no sense of decency, sir? At long last, have you left no sense of decency?
The Atomic Energy Commission hearings weren't a court trial, but they turned into the equivalent of an inquisition. The FBI dossier was kept secret from Oppie's defense while reading parts of it into evidence. They used discrepancies between retellings of his communist friend's approach in 1943 as proof of duplicity. To everyone there, it was obvious railroading and a foregone conclusion. Despite that, Oppie was forced to admit an extramarital affair in front of his wife, and how naive he was at the beginning of the Manhattan Project. The AEC denied his clearance and published a damning profile, which red-baiting media raked him over the coals with. With the jeering of conservatives everywhere, the Oppenheimer family took a much-needed retreat to St. John Island. Even so, the FBI continued to hound him, claiming he might defect on a Russian submarine and forcing Robert to mail an itinerary to Hoover himself. Kitty had long been an alcoholic, and Robert was a bit aloof with their children. The results of the AEC hearings exacerbated these problems. Robert alienated his son by leaving him at a boarding school. Their daughter Toni seemed to have inherited Robert's depression, but nonetheless, Robert and Kitty loved the island, buying a house on the beach and partying into the night. It would be a place of regular refuge. Reinvigorated, Oppie returned to Princeton and regularly took on lecture gigs around the country. He became a bit of a martyr to academic freedom, as Strauss repeatedly failed to oust him from the directorship. Oppie's presence at various lectures was often protested by conservative academics, but that only made his martyrdom seem more important. He still did scientific work, even though he couldn't do any of the secretive work that advanced science so rapidly in the post-war period. But for the most part, he was focused on decrying red baiting. With the election of President Kennedy, Oppie had a friend in the White House again. Arthur Schlesinger Jr. tried to rehabilitate Robert's reputation. He didn't get so far as reinstating Robert's clearance, but got him the Enrico Fermi Award, a scientific commendation given out by presidents. An assassin killed JFK only a month ahead of the ceremony, so newly inaugurated President Johnson did the ceremony instead. Republicans were angry, but couldn't halt the dispensation of a $50,000 reward. To retaliate, they reduced the money by half the following year. 2 years later, Oppie got throat cancer. He was famously a chain smoker, yet he kept living as best he could, resigning from the Institute for Advanced Studies but staying near campus. He died after fighting the affliction for 2 years in 1967. Kitty died in 1972, and their daughter lived on, but was denied a translator position at the UN because the FBI still claimed her father was a commie spy. She took her own life at the St. John Island cottage, deeding the property to the people there, which is still called Oppenheimer Beach. Oppie's legacy is well described as the American Prometheus. Much like the figure of legend, he brought nuclear fire and was punished for that. But perhaps he's more akin to the main character of a book subtitled The Modern Prometheus, as in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. He created something that came to destroy him. Now, Oppie himself never really regretted being the father of the atomic bomb, unlike some popular depictions, but he did regret the missed opportunity of the Acheson-Lilienthal plan and failure to halt the arms race. When the Kennedy administration proposed a partial testing ban, he said, "It's 20 years too late. It should have been done the day after Trinity." His legacy is a long and winding road, but perhaps someday his highest hope can finally be achieved before we have any more nuclear proliferation and annihilate ourselves. The history of the atomic bomb's creation, usage, and stockpiling has been a source of never-ending controversy. Among historians, there's a massive cleavage between orthodox revisionist and post-revisionist views of the Cold War, and that reflects on our interpretations of the bomb that defined that. The basic dispute is over who started that conflict, or which nation was more often the aggressor. Orthodox historians argue communists were to blame, while revisionists argue it was capitalist countries. And post-revisionists basically avoid the blame game altogether by focusing on how the sides operated on misconceptions of each other. I went into a lot more detail in my Cold War Origins episode. Beyond that, laymen take these historical debates and internalize them as part of their identity. I'm sure there's already some idiots claiming I've insulted them. They turn these things into nonsense to act aggrieved and denounce their political enemies. It's foolish, but inevitable rhetoric for people who really don't care about history, only their petty grievances. This division of interpretation informs our understanding of nuclear bombs and their creation. For instance, in 1994, the National Air and Space Museum was designing an exhibit around the Enola Gay. The script leaked and caused a massive controversy because they were intentionally using the exhibit to provoke a national conversation about the use and legacy of nuclear weaponry. Historian Edward Linenthal wrote, "Everyone believed that history and memory had been abused, and the controversy over the Enola Gay exhibit became a useful symbol for all sides in the history wars going on in America." Suffice it to say, they downsized the exhibit and removed much of the interpretation. Sure enough, Oppie's story inspires the same rhetoric. You'll see plenty who denounce him as a communist subverting America, or a whiny weakling unwilling to face reality, or a genocidal maniac bent on destroying Japanese people, and a dupe of the capitalist machine. Obviously, every single one of those are ignorant, but they're built on these fundamental insecurities surrounding nuclear weaponry. We all live in the apocalyptic shadow of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That's why people should strive to understand history before forming opinions about it. Luckily, there have been a lot of good history books on the topic, which you'll find some in my bibliography as per usual. The one that opened up the field of study into these events the most was Richard Rhodes' The Making of the Atomic Bomb in 1987. He revealed the story in then recently declassified documents. More stuff got released throughout the 1990s, leading to the most important book in that bibliography, which is American Prometheus by Kai Bird and Martin J. Sherwin. It's an incredible biography of Oppie and is precisely what Christopher Nolan used to create this movie, but he expands on it. First, this movie has a bit of a convoluted plot, much like other Nolan films. I even reviewed his movie Dunkirk a while back, and much like that one, this labyrinthine storytelling serves a purpose. Here he's done 2 layers of framing devices. We have the first frame of Oppie reviewing his life during the Grey Board hearings.
So-called derogatory information in your indictment of me cannot be fairly understood except in the context of my life.
Then there's Strauss's confirmation hearing in 1959 for Secretary of Commerce, which is differentiated in black and white. Congress ultimately denied him, much like he had gotten Oppie's security clearance beforehand. This shows the persecution of Oppie in parallel. This movie is accurate enough that I'd be better off listing what it gets incorrect real quick before explaining what I like about it so much. Just look at my notes. Those pluses are when I find something particularly accurate. You can guess what the minuses mean, so let's go over them just to prevent any misconceptions from this film. Most are necessary to move the plot along and don't hurt the narrative.
Niels, meet J. Robert Oppenheimer. What's the J stand for? Nothing.
Bohr and Oppenheimer didn't know each other until after Oppie got his PhD.
Then I was entirely consumed with what he must have said to Einstein to sour him on me.
So this misperceived wrong from the first meeting with Strauss is central to the plot, but it was never expressed in real life, especially on the floor of Congress. It's just a contrivance.
I'd say isotopes are less useful than electronic components, but more useful than a sandwich.
The movie makes a big deal about the hearings where Oppenheimer okayed sending isotopes to other countries for their nuclear power programs, which was in fact over Strauss's wishes. While they did differ on this issue, it wasn't the thing driving a wedge between them. That was Oppie's opposition to the super. Oppie absolutely fought for his reputation during the Grey Board, because it was very much rigged against him. This could simply be Kitty's misconception, but this becomes the key to Nolan's interpretation of the character, so it appears more important. I guess you can argue Oppie could have fought harder, but he didn't simply roll over for the thrashing he received.
There was chloral hydrate in her blood. There was a note.
Jean Tatlock likely committed suicide. Many scholars are doubtful of that, but those doubts should not be portrayed as a certainty. Otherwise, that's just conspiracizing and therefore a flat-out lie.
You gave the file to Borden, you set him on Oppenheimer, you convinced him...
Borden didn't take any convincing.
Strauss leaking the FBI file is also portrayed as certain when historians can only speculate. This is necessary for the plot, as kind of a cathartic reveal for why Strauss's rejection at the confirmation hearing is justified, but we don't know whether or not he actually did that. But all in all, those aren't that much in terms of inaccuracy. The last 2 are kinda necessary to the plot, but hinder the actual narrative. Given the sheer amount of things this movie gets correct and ties together, I'm happy to overlook them. Like, there's some visualizations in this that are pretty awesome. When trying to explain physics problems, we see these practical effects that work really well.
Correct. Increasing gravity.
Increasing density. What's the limit here?
I don't know.
Fission of material into a larger sphere with enough force to achieve criticality.
Air blast inwards, crushing the material.
And it is kinda tasteful about the horrors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, only showing Oppie dealing with it all through some abstract imagery. Unlike the Smithsonian's attempted Enola Gay exhibit, which would have purposefully shocked people with ghastly images and artifacts, we don't have to see it in order to understand what tragedy America inflicted on Japan to end the war. Now, I gotta admit, I was a bit disappointed with the gasoline explosion used by Nolan to simulate the Trinity test. He could have just used actual footage, and it's a lot better. Nonetheless, there are so many details that add texture.
When's this place supposed to open?
2 months.
Take off that ridiculous uniform.
For instance, here's an easy-to-miss one.
There's no kitchen.
So the reason why their house didn't have a kitchen is that it was from the old Los Alamos Ranch School that the Army took over. Students, teachers, and administrators all ate together.
Welcome to Los Alamos. If there's a boys' school, we'll have to commandeer, and the local Indians come up here for burial rites, but...
Oppie even later mentions the nearby pueblo.
What should we do with it?
Give it back to the Indians.
Which is San Ildefonso, a few miles down the road. Furthermore, the movie goes into the decision to drop Fat Man and Little Boy better than the 1989 movie by that name.
The A-bomb might not cause as much damage as the Tokyo bombings.
A terrible revelation of divine power.
If that's true, it would be definitive. World War II would be over.
Is there no way to demonstrate the bomb to Japan?
We intend to demonstrate it in the most unambiguous terms. Twice.
The use of the atomic bomb on Japanese cities will save lives.
Well, if we use this weapon without informing our allies, they'll see it as a threat, and we'll be in an arms race.
President Truman has no intention of raising expectations that Stalin be included in the atomic project.
Informing him of our breakthrough and presenting it as a means to win the war need not make unkeepable promises.
Did Truman brief Stalin at Potsdam?
Referred to a powerful new weapon.
It's a very difficult topic to cover, and this film does it well. The movie seeks to answer one of the most enduring questions surrounding Oppenheimer.
You're the father of the atomic bomb, so...
He's often thought of as being the reluctant father of the A-bomb, yet, as the film correctly points out,
J. Robert Oppenheimer, if he could do it all over, he'd do it all the same. You know he's never once said that he regrets Hiroshima?
he never expressed regret, yet is often thought to have, with his famous quote from the Bhagavad Gita.
And now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
So the movie seeks to interpret that key issue, and that's central to the strange plot structure and framing devices. But to do that, I do have to go into spoilers. I can't spoil history, but I can spoil a twist in interpretation. It's genuinely fascinating, but if you haven't seen it, I don't want to ruin it for you. So you've been warned. You see, that thing that this version of Strauss keeps whining about...
I was entirely consumed with what he must have said to Einstein to sour him on me.
There's repeated references to the fact that Oppie thought Hiroshima and Nagasaki were necessary.
And this isn't a new weapon. It's a new world.
When the world learns the terrible secret of Los Alamos, our work here will ensure a peace mankind has never seen. Once it's used, nuclear war, perhaps... all war becomes unthinkable.
We're also reminded of his post-war vision to prevent an arms race.
Now is our chance to secure international cooperation on atomic energy. And
Do you know when the Soviets are gonna have the bomb?
I don't think I could give it.
Never.
By limiting the spread of atomic weapons through international control on nuclear energy.
By which you mean world government.
The United Nations. Do you understand? If we build a hydrogen bomb, the Russians will have no choice but to build their own.
But that, of course, never came to be. So Oppie's legacy was in danger as soon as the AEC chose the Super over the Acheson-Lilienthal plan, even before the Grey Board inquiry. So Nolan is making an argument about that legacy and how Oppie engineered it, with Strauss's megalomania becoming his own undoing as he realizes what Oppie has done.
J. Robert Oppenheimer, the martyr, to be remembered for Trinity, not Hiroshima, not Nagasaki.
Did you think that if you let them tar and feather you, then the world would forgive you?
We'll see.
Yeah, he's arguing that Oppie willingly became a martyr for science in order to secure his legacy. That's what the fictional conversation between Einstein and Oppie was about. They show LBJ giving the Fermi Award to Oppie and say,
"The award really wasn't for me, it was for all of you. Now it's your turn to deal with the consequences of your achievement."
It's a brilliant interpretation, and unique as far as I can tell. Nolan genuinely brought something new beyond his source material. It keeps the unrepentance of Oppie and explains why he was always preening about blood on his hands or whatever.
I feel that I have blood on my hands.
You need to stop playing the martyr.
It was an endgame to bring back the Atchison-Lilienthal plan, if not in his lifetime, then in ours. Nuclear proliferation is still an ever-present problem, hence why the fictional conversation ends like this.
When I came to you with those calculations, we thought we might start a chain reaction that would destroy the entire world.
I remember it well.
I believe we did.
We're still teetering on the brink of destroying the world. This is a necessary reminder that the nuclear fire Oppie brought into the world didn't only take 250,000 Japanese lives, but destroyed the lives of millions as the Cold War kept global conflict simmering with an arms race that acts like a sword of Damocles for us all. By Nolan's interpretation, Oppie understood that long before we even had the term mutually assured destruction.
Two scorpions in a bottle, each capable of killing the other, but only at the risk of his own life. Candor is the only remedy.
And he secured his legacy as a martyr to the cause of ending nuclear proliferation. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, mutually assured destruction is a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Meow. I knew you'd try to come in. You always do. Oh, thank you. Yes, good boy. Mwah.
The first test of a non-nuclear destination? Non-nuclear destination. That's most destinations.
Meow.
Where are you going? And weaponry worldwide. Wow, I cannot say that. Weaponry worldwide. And weaponry worldwide. As Strauss repeatedly failed to oust him from the dictatorship.
Just wanted some attention.